All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining the session. My name is Abdul. I'm speaking to you from, well, where I live in Hamilton here in Ontario. So thank you, everybody, for taking the time to attend this session. And want to thank the organizers for inviting Easy Projects to this conference. A little bit about myself before I actually get rolling with the presentation. I've had the pleasure of working in the IT industry for over 15 years, including stints at Oracle, Salesforce, and most recently until the present day, Easy Projects. So specifically with Easy Projects, I've had 5 years of exposure working specifically with project management organizations and various teams looking to optimize visibility and capacity planning operations from various functions in the organization. I'm going to stop the video just for bandwidth purposes. I know we have a lot of people on the call. So as we know, the most valuable asset in successful projects are your resources. Effective resource management is critical to utilizing your resources to their full potential, so your team can deliver the best possible results. Drawing upon the experience in working with hundreds of project management teams, the next, let's call it 35, 40 minutes, is really about distilling the top 7 resource management best practices that myself and the team at Easy Projects has kind of gathered in order to transfer that success to you. And perhaps you can get a couple of tidbits that you can take back to your organizations, whether now or in the future, in your future stations in your career. So before we go through the actual 7 practices or 7 best practices for resource management, I'd like to share some specific quantitative findings from a wide-ranging user survey that we conducted. This is original from Easy Projects, a user survey that we conducted about the state of work and project management in both 2019 and 2020. Now, this has not been updated to reflect remote work, but we only anticipate some of these outcomes to be amplified, with the new normal of remote work. And so specifically, I wanted to, as we go through this, piece here, and won't take too much time, but just give you context as to the importance of the talk and why this topic is of high criticality. If some of these findings resonate with you in your current role or function, or you've heard about them before, it is vindication that you're not alone. And that's even, again, more important in 2020 with remote work becoming the norm. So to start with, as you can tell here with these couple of metrics, 55% of respondents reported an increase in stress at work. And now we're hearing a lot about Zoom fatigue. We are on Zoom calls all day today. And, a lot of my clients talk about back-to-back Zoom calls. So there's a lot of stress, a lot of ask to do more with less. And then 42% of project managers believe that they do not have enough time to complete their work. This ultimately has negative implications on a few things, not the least of which is work-life balance of not only the project managers, but the people who report to them. And of course, it's going to have implications on schedule delivery metrics, so being able to deliver on time, whether it's by deliverable or by project, and naturally quality of work that's actually delivered. Another interesting stats that we picked up is 40% of project managers report that work is not completed on time due to lack of prioritization. So this topic of prioritization comes up a lot, and it is linked to resource management. So let me elaborate a little bit. Organizing priorities and processes is something that often comes from your project management office or organization or upper management, depending on how your organization is structured. We found that 40% of project managers report that the work is not completed on time due to a lack of prioritization. If you find that upper management is not providing the proper guidance for projects to move forward, it is up to you then, left up to you to have that discussion, make a proposal on what would make your team happier. With all of the help that is available to us today in terms of technological solutions, it's shocking that the stress levels are rising. So there is something you can do about it to gain control, to prioritize. What I can tell you is, just from my personal experience working with our top performing clients and organizations that we work with, There is a gradual and pragmatic approach to prioritizing and ranking work, but really in whatever shape it takes, it tends to focus on several key areas. So namely, strategic alignment of work or the project. So a number of the organizations that I work with tend to have a number of strategic objectives that a project should fall under. This doesn't have to be exclusive to enterprise grade companies or larger organizations. I've seen a ton of SMBs or SMEs adopt this strategy, maybe a right-sized version of the strategy. So the first thing is determine whether the project aligns with your overall strategic imperatives. But the second piece is around the topic of the day, which is around the resource fit and availability. It might be the best project from a strategic alignment perspective, but you just don't have the people for it who are available, or you don't have the people with the right skills for it. And that's why this is relevant today. And then there's a risk assessment that takes place typically, again, as part of the project ranking and prioritization. And then what we find is that organizations will add more and more cardinal, quantitative/qualitative measures in order to go through their crawl, walk, run approach from a project ranking perspective. This one is quite interesting. So 51% of project managers don't feel like they receive actionable solutions from upper management when a project is at risk, particularly because the most popular risk that we see is also resource constraints. So project managers are in this interesting position as middle management. Middle management is the space, as you know, where you are both managing a team of reports, but are also being managed by directors, VPs, or the PMO leadership. So with this kind of dynamic from a personnel perspective and a cultural perspective, giving and receiving guidance and feedback can be crucial to helping projects succeed. So when we talk about finding 51% of project managers don't feel like they receive actionable solutions from upper management when a project is at risk or when a risk like resource constraints is flagged, that can be quite surprising, but these are real stats. So to fix this issue, naturally PMs need to get creative to become more assertive and forthcoming. And when we're in a position of responsibility, many of us tend to pretend that we have the absolutely everything under control at all times, sort of a hero kind of persona. This act on its own can have negative impacts on project managers as they become stressed if the project is not going well or as expected. So again, re-emphasizing the challenges that resource constraints present. And another one in the snowball of metrics that we've identified in relation to resource challenges, 37% of those surveyed said that they do not have the resources to complete their work. So that's kind of the plain stat around the presentation. So there's always work to do and lots of it. Another stat that's not here, but related, is that 62% of respondents claim that there has been a significant increase in volume. So I got more work to do, but I don't have resources to do it. That's essentially what we're hearing from people. Do we have enough resources to keep up? The answer is kind of, but not really. And that's the limbo that people find themselves in. So they go into upper management asking for people or for more knowledge workers, and it's kind of like, well, can you survive without? And you just don't have that assertive answer, right? And so that's kind of what we're finding. People are telling us, yeah, I don't have, well, I kind of have resources. I'm not really sure. And that's, that really is a recipe for not getting any kind of approval on additional resources. Now, these three stats are related to the top 3 reasons why teams struggle to complete work. So take a look at it and give you kind of a few seconds to take a look. So around changing the plans for requirements midway through, unable to manage expectations of leadership, inaccurate time estimates, and they're all around the 45 to 50% area. So it's kind of it's kind of a coin toss as to whether your requirements will stay the same and if you're going to be given enough time to adjust in the middle of the projects within flight projects. So want to draw your attention to those numbers that have to do with setting expectations on timelines, schedules, and resource needs. These are, in fact, troublesome stats, and they do point to a constantly changing set of expectations and a highly stressful environment for project managers. So this is perhaps the most challenging aspect in any role, and let's face it, it's exhausting. Oftentimes, we think our team is going to finish something by a certain date, but it just doesn't pan out that way. There are always a million reasons for something to go wrong. Project managers say that their top reasons for uncompleted work are changing requirements, inability to manage expectations, and inaccurate time estimates. So when we get deeper with our clients, just to give you the anecdote on my end, they talk to us about a lack of governance when it comes to resource requests, which leads to worker burnout and cultural implications, in an environment where people don't feel supported to finish the job at hand because they inexplicably get pulled and put on something else. And so the meaning of work starts to dissipate in the process as well. So that's something to think about as well. It's not just the ability to finish the work, it's what's the impact on the people when there is a lot of uncertainty and a lot of change, especially if it's change that's not really explained or predicted well. And then I'm going to conclude let's call it the outlining of the challenge here with this slide. One final finding here is when we asked the project leaders about what's top of mind for them in terms of challenges to resolve, resource management came in only second to better visibility. And the reason visibility, when I say visibility, they're typically talking about, identifying project status and where the portfolios are at, and perhaps some financials and things like that. So the key metrics around the project. Now, the visibility comes first typically because that's what the executive is asking for every day or every week. And then the project managers are spending the weekends doing those Excel reports. So I once had a client in a billable project scenario. So they're delivering projects to their client and they are in a PMO leadership capacity in the IT services sector. Tell me they don't even know if they're making money on the project. And the main reason is, so their client-facing resources all had six-figure incomes. So we're talking about a high, rare skill type of resourcing. They even participated in the pre-sales cycle before the project even got closed. So before even, they won the business to deliver the project. It's a project-based organization. So we're not even at the delivery and they're not really sure where the cycles are being spent, which is a big issue because ultimately they couldn't really tell, are we charging enough for this? Is the budget sufficient? Is the revenue sufficient as well to support the continuous delivery of this type of work at our current costs? And again, these are challenges that real people are experiencing just like you every single day. So again, it shows a disconnect that can often be present when there aren't a number of standardized resource management practices that are adhered to. This gets even more complex when you have matrix organizational structures where resource borrowing can be a very common occurrence. And it's just going to be a lot of confusion, particularly when it comes to so-called superstars who are in high demand within certain organizations. So it sounds bleak so far, but all hope is not lost. There are some things you can do to switch the channel to a more positive kind of tone. So as I've mentioned at the top of the webinar, I've been fortunate enough to work with hundreds of project management leaders. The entire team at Easy Projects has as well. And we try to distill the top 7 practices for you so you can use them as anchors when you formulate your own resource management strategy in whatever capacity, whatever seniority, whatever function you take on now or in the future in your project management careers. Every group I speak to has a different culture, nomenclature, personnel type, receptivity to increased visibility. These are all factors to consider when talking about things like resource management best practices. Therefore, keep in mind as we go through the next few slides, change management principles apply. Most importantly, executive support, stakeholder management are crucial components for the success of transforming the way you manage your resources. Finally, keep in mind that this is a journey, not a destination. Think of these practices as paths towards project and resource management excellence that will enable you to become an organization that practices continuous improvement. Benchmark, identify gaps, measure, improve, measure, improve again, and so on and so forth. So it's not a one and done exercise. It's not either or. It's let me establish a baseline. Let me establish a number of best practices. Let me get a closed loop feedback system going. And then, we can iterate from there. So as you think through this, I'm going to share some, let's call it aspirational pictures of what success might look like. How you translate that in your organization or your role is a conversation that is very, very nuanced depending on your specific situation. So let's start with that. So the first practice is identify the top 10% of your overloaded and underloaded stuff. And what we're sharing here is a sample dashboard. So I had a client with, so the idea behind this is, and this is true for even the second practice that we're going to share, is what's your 80-20 rule, right? So I had a client with over 40 reports within their, so they had 40 people report to them within their organizational structure. Some people were simply being forgotten. Some of the 40 people were simply being forgotten because it was just hectic, right? So it was a lot of one-on-ones with no way to highlight the most severe allocation challenges. And they were trying to treat everybody the same way. Determining which people are overloaded allows management to reassign projects to other team members and keep a more balanced workload amongst the team. By focusing on only the top 10% of both overloaded and underloaded personnel, you'll be able to make the biggest impact in the shortest time frame, as opposed to trying to solve resource allocation for the entire company. Now, this might seem like an obvious practice, but it is easier said than done, really, at least from our experience. It takes a highly collaborative effort to arrive at the graphic you're seeing here. Right? So what you've got here is, as you can tell on the graph, you've got actuals, got projections for 1 month, and then I'm comparing that with a 4-month forecast and capacity average. So I don't end up making a decision isolated from the overall timeline. Right away, you implement something like this, or it doesn't have to be like this. You start to really prioritize top 10%, top 5%, whatever your benchmark is, right? You get a very different one-on-one, or in these days, let's call it a one-on-one Zoom call with your resources, because now we're talking about data, not opinions, not simply qualitative, right? We're talking quantitative and qualitative updates. For a lot of organizations, this type of analysis may seem like a pipe dream. Again, my feedback here and my advice is focus on the journey, not the destination, right? So identify this as a goal, as an aspirational goal, as a best practice, as a fundamental principle, as an anchor, and then start with something small but valid. Get some consensus on it to represent your version of top 10 or top 5. What you don't want to do is do top 50, because as one of my mentors once said, if everything is important, then nothing is important, right? So along the same or similar lines, pinpoint, this is the second practice, pinpoint the resources and projects falling short of or exceeding projections. So similar to the previous point, do a top 10 on this, but this time, this takes a more of a performance management perspective and benchmarking. So this practice, this best practice, is particularly useful when you have an organization that is laser focused on improving utilization rates with billable resources. Particularly, it has the highest, it has impact everywhere, but this type of analysis is particularly useful when you are trying to manage billable resources with financial impact. Most companies are already doing a good job of identifying projects where the actual time spent exceeded the original estimates. It is also important to take that to the next step, though, and find out the root cause of the discrepancy. For example, could it be poor performance of the assigned resources? Or, to put it differently, could it be that they are not supported with the appropriate skills or not enabled with the appropriate skills to take on a specific job? Could it be an overly optimistic plan by the project manager to start, right? Or the original plan was conceived based on incomplete information. Could it be scope creep, meaning the risks around scope weren't identified early enough? And more and more requests or change requests were added without introducing a proper change management process or channel that would ultimately update the resource plan as needed and be able to make sure that we stay on track. Could it be a combination of the above factors? And it typically is. So a practice of identifying projects where the actual time spent was below projection is less common. However, it is equally important to analyze such situations. The following possible reasons will certainly require different corrective measures. For example, if you got an assigned resource, so if you have assigned resources that are superstars, for example, they tend to be in high demand. And part of the reason they're superstars, and we joke with our clients about this, but it's true, is quite frequently they don't say no to anything, right? So you kind of have to protect them. And they're well known within the organization. I want her to do my, project, for example, because, she's done a tremendous job before. It is ultimately the role of the project manager to put some governance and control around that. A project manager, sometimes you can identify things like, with something like this, you can identify when a project manager has a tendency, so let's say you're a PMO leader, and you identify that certain project managers have a tendency to pad time too much. So you identify those. So somebody's trying to estimate correctly and they pad time way too much, and now they reserve resources for too long. So how do you detect that? These are the things, these are the questions that you want to put as anchors and then plan from there. And then things like project scope was reduced midway, but then something else has happened. So these are all things that that can contribute to having a significant number of resources falling short or falling short of projections. And then the flip side of it is you want to identify where people are exceeding projections. Identifying and understanding the reasons behind actual versus planned variance will help your organization become more efficient and disciplined when it comes to resource estimates. Again, the key here is benchmarking. So Abby is projected to hit X hours, so what, right? So it doesn't mean anything, right? So regardless of how you do this, don't settle for an absolute metric without adding contextual metrics to define it or benchmark it. So we found through experience, and I mean a lot of experience, that non-management personnel, meaning resources that you're managing, prefer to know ahead of time what they are being measured against and relative to who. So if I'm looking at the same dashboard my manager or my project management manager is looking at, like, boom, right? So I know what to expect. I know how to improve. But if you give me a number and simply ask me to hit it and do better without clearly showing me a contextual metric like goal, capacity, running average, peer group performance, that, if you add those contextual metrics, now I have meaning to my work. I can redirect my efforts properly, and we can have a better one-on-one from a performance management perspective. And I can link that to my actual job on the ground where the world is not ideal. So we've got to overcome that disconnect between performance management and behavioral change. Again, this is simply an example, of what can, but I think the focus here that I want to draw your attention to is you'll see quite a few trend lines there. The green is the average 4-month capacity versus the yellow, the average 4 month, and then there's a difference, there's an actual. So I'm doing comparative analysis, and it's very easy for the eye to pick that up, right? Now, this one seems obvious, but the devil is in the details. So compare capacity with forecast. By comparing your resource capacity with the demand forecast on a regular basis, you will be able to make better and more informed business decisions. Ramp up business development in a billable scenario, for example, or in internal PMO project management, at least show openness to take on more work when the demand is lower than capacity. Scale up hiring if you have more demand than you can handle, or at least slow down the requests or communicate to the requesters what you're dealing with from an availability perspective. I mean, the big thing is setting realistic deadlines for new projects by understanding the true availability of your resources in the future, not just in a moment in time, but in the future. Quite often, when speaking to my own clients who are looking to improve their resource planning, I notice a few details that are missed for a variety of reasons, but they're critical details. So things like they don't include vacations in their analysis, or they forget to, right? Again, it seems like an obvious thing, but you'd be surprised how many people kind of miss that. And then, oh, and then there's a Slack conversation. It's like, oh, I'm off next week. Well, I didn't know, right? And the amount of the amount of juggling as a result of that mini conversation is astounding. I mean, that's an extra number of hours where so again, set your anchors, right? Like determine what's going to keep you sane from a resource management perspective. So things like vacations I've seen, things like not looking at it by team division, right? Not looking at things by, who are the teams, and I really need to analyze what's happening, particularly when there's common borrowing between teams. Again, we see organized chaos, right? And that's not good. Or something simple as not excluding projects that are in a hold status for the next 2 months, for example. So we're working on a project, something happens outside our control, it's on hold for a bit, could be a few weeks, could be a couple of months, but somehow, in my analysis, the persons who were assigned to that work are still working on it, and there's a lack of communication, right? So again, just making sure that you include all the aspects that, update your capacity with forecasts so you can make better decisions. In addition to that, one of the most common problems that we see is when a project management organization fails to recognize early enough that they have too much work, or too little work for that matter, for the next period, whatever that period is, whether it's a month, a quarter. Usually that's the window that people look at, either by weeks, a month, or a quarter. So they either decline to do too many requests and they find themselves having too many people on the bench for X number of days, sometimes weeks in extreme cases, or they just get flooded with requests and never say no. And then you get burnout, personnel issues, HR issues, quality degradation, etc. So one of the best KPIs, or key performance indicators, that we've seen our clients use is this concept of work aggression, right? So in a billable scenario, it might be business development aggression. In internal PMO, it might be just being able to take on work. But this concept of aggression, how aggressive do we need to be in looking for or accepting more work? Again, start with simple definitions. Don't over-engineer things to start. Define what's red, yellow, and green. Like in this example, you have the aggression here. You see high at the lowest row is what I'm looking at, right? So high, medium, right? High, medium, low. What's green, what's yellow, what's red, right? So start with basic definitions. Don't over-engineer things, and find a way to estimate work. I work with a lot of clients who don't track time. And for example, that just our organization is not ready to track time. That's okay. Find a way to quantify work, right? It's not always the case that you're going to have your organization ready to estimate hours down to the lowest activity level. Find a way to do it. Is it hours, number of tasks, sprints? Start somewhere, but just don't leave yourself hanging without anything, because very soon you'll find yourself overwhelmed, or the team will find itself overwhelmed or not doing enough. So again, super important to link your resource management metrics to your request management process, which is a whole different topic that can have its own webinar, and have a health indicator to define your posture on accepting new work, or set better expectations to your clients, whether they are internal or external. The second practice, the next practice here, is to regularly review and catch resource conflicts. So this is another illustration about how this is a journey, not a destination. To use another cliche, what got you here won't get you there, right? So we want to go back on a regular basis and continuously review allocation. and allocation practices as well. Project timelines are always changing, and so does the demand for resources and your team's availability. You should make it a habit to regularly review resource allocation to ensure that projects are always staffed with the right amount of people with the right combination of skills. And this is where skills, this is why, we're showing you this example here in this slide. Because a lot of the work, high value work, requires knowledge workers, even in manufacturing, right? Even people on the so-called floor shop, people need to be empowered with certain skills to do the work, and you cannot afford to have a repetitive or systemic quality degradation or disappointing quality in deliverables just because you weren't enabled to identify the right skill for the right job, right? So you should make it a habit to regularly review that. And that way you get the most up-to-date picture of when a new project comes in and you have to assess your team's capacity. In addition to regular review based on availability, you want to add a skill dimension to your analysis, as we said, so we can allocate the right people to the right work. Now, skill inventory is key to successful project management organizations or competency matrices, depending on your naming convention, how complex or how simple you want to make it. The point is that have something to start. You can tie that eventually, and our top performing clients eventually tie that to their talent management and personnel development strategy. If you're wearing that human capital leadership perspective or hat, right? So what skills do we have today? Where are we repetitively seeing gaps when we talk about allocation? Where can we have targeted training internally within the group that aligns with both the career progression goals of the resources and the type of work and the type of projects that we're being required to finish? That is a lot more cost effective and faster than all the time having to hire, right? And waiting for the ramp up time, waiting for that cultural integration to happen. And again, particularly right now, it's, onboarding is different now, of course. It's successful, it's possible, repeatable, but how do we make the most out of the resources that we have, the people that we have, while still aligning with their career goals? So the top performing organizations that we talk to tend to have that mindset of, how can I work with the people that I have, improve their lives, improve our lives, and deliver better outcomes? These are all areas that can add short and long-term value for your organization if adopted correctly, right? This one is very popular within client-facing, so organizations that deliver client-facing billable projects. So this concept of, and this is not new to you, but the concept is just a reminder, concept of utilization rates. So compare your planned and actual resource utilization. So utilization rates, just again, for stating something that a lot of people on the call would know, it shows the ratio between the reported billable hours to the total available hours. It's one of the most important levers that affects the company's profitability. Not only is it critical to regularly monitor actual utilization rates for your ongoing projects, but it is equally important to compare it to the planned utilization rate. So if your actual utilization was higher than planned, was it caused by, I don't know, poorly scheduled deadlines, which forced the team to work overtime? Was it at the expense of other projects? How is that linked to the lifetime value of the client? Or the value, even in internal scenarios, the value that the project was supposed to deliver, or the cost savings that the project was supposed to deliver? If the actual utilization rate was below your plan, your profit margin goal might be at risk. It is recommended that you track the utilization rate on both the project, team, and individual user levels to uncover hidden inefficiencies in your resource planning process. So it's not just a matter of taking it in a moment in time, in a project in time. It's about detecting the hidden trends, right? And we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But this is one area where we see a lot of gaps in terms of, just last week I had an executive kind of say, hey, if I want to know if a project is profitable, I sort of do the wind test, right? So they just don't know. And that's okay. So again, it's okay to be there. It's just a function of prioritizing this, looking at it, making it part of a framework, and then coming up with solutions or looking for ideas in the industry for that. The other thing that we would want to share here is just be aware of different utilization rates, metrics, and different definitions. Again, each client we talk to prioritizes different metrics. So there's not a one and done solution for all in terms of how you think about utilization rates. But just to give you examples, utilization rate, billable hours divided by total available hours as a percentage. And then you take a percentage. Utilization rate is helpful to determine if you have enough billable work for your resources. If this number is low, it means naturally that your team is spending way too much time working on internal projects. Versus a concept like realization rate, which is the total billed hours divided by the total billable hours and then taken as a percentage. So that means the implication is a low realization rate would indicate that you are not using your resources profitably. And then you have concepts like realized rate. And so in this case, realized rate equals the realization rate, which we talked about a second ago, times the billing rate in dollars. Realized rate is useful to determine how profitable your resources are and whether you need to increase your billing rates or the number of billable hours. So again, it has an implication on what you charge your clients for the work and then the number of hours that you originally estimated or frankly, somebody estimated, right? And we in billable organizations, we talk a lot about the sales services handoff and right? So pre-sales estimates, but need to check with services if the estimate is correct, etc. So all of that needs to be revised. And the only way to do that, frankly, is to come up with the appropriate metrics on utilization rates and realization rates and realized rates. So one of the key challenges that I've personally seen with a lot of organizations, particularly in the engineering and managed service, IT managed service providers industry, is the inability to track variable billing rates depending on the project. So while, to give you an example, let's say you have somebody, Steve, let's say, right? So Steve's internal rate to the business may be uniform, right? So, his cost to the business might be $60 an hour or, whatever currency you're adopting. His billable rate, on the other hand, can vary depending on the client, project, etc. So that presents a significant data challenge for a lot of organizations that we talk to. So this is something you want to think about when you build out your tracking and get accurate, in order to get accurate numbers on these critical metrics that have an implication on your resource planning and profitability. In other cases, we've seen use cases where you're running a project for the government, for example. So, and we've seen this with government contractors, let's say. And your project spans multiple years. So you've got a 3-year project. Now that can be challenging, not because the project is lengthy, that's fine. The challenge is that those contracts quite often tend to have annual escalators that change the rates on an annual basis. So, so-and-so's rate is, 150 an hour in 2020, but the contract stipulates that in 2021, it's going to be, 160 or 155, right? And that, again, has an implication on the overall project profitability calculation. It makes your life easier when you think about these things ahead of time, instead of being surprised by them and then retroactively trying to do all these calculations. Not good quality of life doing that stuff on the weekend, right? So think about all these things as you draw up your own personal framework as to how you want to work through these challenges. One last wrinkle that we've also seen quite frequently is dealing with utilization rates when it comes to subcontractors. So you've got your internal reports that are full-time employees that are working under your team, but you also have subcontractors who occasionally, or sometimes more than occasionally, have to augment. So staff augmentation is necessary. Those can take away from your margin, of course, because they cost more than your internal resources. So it's not a bad idea. It's actually a very good idea to segment tracking those utilization rates. Think of them as a team, which has different characteristics. I can tell you that your CFO will appreciate it if you can provide that type of analysis. So think about all those wrinkles as you're embarking on this idea of utilization rates. So yes, at a very basic level, it seems like a very novel, simple concept, but it has so many implications and so many wrinkles. These are things that, you know, we're just sharing what we're hearing from our clients in terms of the kinds of things that they have to deal with on a regular basis. And then run resource loading simulations. So don't just rely on reports when planning resource allocations. Try running resource loading simulations for upcoming or potential projects as well. A simulation can warn you of potential resource conflicts or show you how your preliminary plan will impact existing project schedules. So for best results, our advice is to try different scenarios, right? Different variations of allocated resources to see which combination of assignments would deliver the most optimal results. One of the most annoying things for a project manager is to get a message of, or to, you know, maybe on Slack or somebody says on a Zoom, hey, can you give us a quick answer on if we can do X, Y, Z? Right, just a rough answer is fine, right? And in the back of their mind, they're thinking, oh, this should take me 5 minutes, right? Or this should take the project manager 5 minutes. So you want to have the mechanisms to enable you to run a simulation based on certain inputs like start and end date, skills, specific teams, maybe specific individuals that are often requested, project status, portfolio, risk. I mean, these are inputs that you can predetermine very quickly at the beginning of the planning cycle without going forward and building the whole work breakdown structure, right? Because a lot of times that project might not even happen. So you don't want to go and kind of spend all this time and build out the project and then come back to the person with an answer and they go like, well, okay, thank you. And then you never hear back again. So what we've often found is there's a hidden waste of time of deep estimation on resource needs and resource allocation and assignments in a lot of work that doesn't even get authorized, right? And versus a kind of a rough order of magnitude concept with proper simulation that takes, you know, what's happening today and what could happen across multiple dimensions. So again, let me remind you here, if all of this sounds ideal, again, crawl, walk, run, right? So create your own version of a starting point and then elevate your game from there. And then finally, search for the hidden patterns and insights. And we alluded to this a few times already. So this is, you know, naturally my favorite part. It's where insights lead to continuous improvement cultures. So while it's tempting to choose an easy path of only reviewing high-level data for your resource capacity, forecast, or actuals, a wiser option would be to regularly perform a more detailed analysis. So segmenting your resourcing data using various criteria, such as customer, portfolio, project team, business unit, project manager, et cetera, might help uncover non-trivial insights or patterns. So for example, some of the things that we've seen. How do your portfolios compare in terms of resource utilization? Do you have teams or people that consistently complete assignments faster than their colleagues? Maybe they can share what they're doing. Maybe their colleagues aren't bad people, they're just, or bad performance. It's just they need to be enabled with some best practice. Maybe both can share, right? Is there any seasonality to resource overloading? I mean, we find that in quite a few situations. So these are things that these are things that you want to be paying attention to. Knowing and acting on these insights will most definitely positively impact your bottom line. We had a project-based organization, just to share here as we conclude the presentation. We had a project-based organization embark on a digital transformation journey. You're talking about 400 employees. All they do is client projects. One of the key challenges was their inability to decide on the trends that they'd like to track. There was a gap between the visibility that executives wanted versus what was possible versus what the PMs thought was important. Through a number of whiteboarding and road mapping sessions, we helped bridge the gap. The point here is that the key element, though, was a soft launch. So think about that as, how do I get to a point where I detect hidden patterns? So soft launch, feedback loops, scorecards for users to track their progress, and then an eventual hard launch. So the lessons learned from a journey like this would be, while the trend analysis is a great aspirational goal, we need to recognize, again, it's a journey, and it's also seen from different perspectives depending on your role. So part of your role will be bridging that gap between upper management and your reports and personnel. How do you build a project management culture that celebrates transparency, failing early and often, knowledge sharing, and continuous improvement. This is even more challenging now with remote work, right? We're seeing a lot of creative practices in that regard, but the fundamental element remains about creating trust within organizations by understanding people's motivations, learning about their personal lives, and understanding their career goals. So just to conclude, I know we talked today a lot about metrics, numbers, and you've seen a lot of dashboards here. But if there's anything, that I'd like you to walk away with today, if there's one thing from this webinar regarding managing and leading knowledge workers, people, resources, especially during this time, these challenging times, it's this. I think just be human, right? And I think that's sometimes, through all the work and the stress gets lost in translation. So with that, I want to thank you all for listening. I want to thank the organizers again. More than happy to connect with the attendees. I'm available on, as you can see here, on LinkedIn, my email and my direct phone. We're more than happy to talk to you and answer any questions. Thank you all for listening, and we do appreciate the participation.